Hi guys, hope you are doing good. Today we are going to study about the demand side policies. So demand side policies are implemented for two reasons. One is either to increase the aggregate demand when the aggregate demand is direly low in the economy and the aggregate demand needs to be boosted. The other could be when the aggregate demand is too high. Ideally, demand side policies could again be implemented in order to reduce the inflation, because one of the direct consequences of a very high aggregate demand would be a very high level of inflation in the economy. So what are the two different types of demand side policies which we are going to study in this particular lesson? It is divided into two categories. One is fiscal policy and the other is monetary policies. So ideally, fiscal policies would be implemented by the government, whereas monetary policies are implemented by the central bank of that particular country. Ideally, compared to fiscal policies, monetary policies are more often implemented because it is beneficial from the perspective of the fact that it takes much lesser time to be implemented. It can be implemented with immediate effect, whereas fiscal policy does take a longer time to be implemented and put to ground. So fiscal policies have two instruments which are primarily used in order to increase the aggregate demand or reduce inflation. One would be government spending and the other would be government spending and the other one would be taxes. So if the aggregate demand is very low in the economy and the aggregate demand needs to be increased, ideally we would be implementing expansionary fiscal policy. So how we would be using the instruments in case of expansionary fiscal policy? Ideally, we would increase the aggregate demand by either we would increase the government spending, and or we would reduce the taxes. So you need to understand what happens when the government spending increases. Obviously, if the government decides that the government will be spending more in terms of building the infrastructure of the country, schools, colleges, hospitals, ideally more number of people would be employed for the construction of these infrastructural facilities, and in the process more employment would be generated. So when more employment is generated, automatically people would have more disposable money in their wallet, and they would obviously have a propensity to spend that money, which in turn will give a boost to the aggregate demand, and as a result the country's aggregate demand would increase. Likewise, when taxes are reduced, ideally people would again have more disposable money in their wallet, because now they do not have to pay the taxes to the government and they are left with greater amount of money from their overall income, which in turn they would be spending in order to buy various goods and services for their household, and that in turn would again give a boost to the aggregate demand. In both the cases, whenever government spending increases and or taxes reduce, obviously the aggregate demand is bound to increase. Whereas when contractionary fiscal policy is implemented, ideally the government spending would be reduced and taxes will be increased. In both the cases, exactly the opposite effect would be visualized. When the government spending reduces, ideally there would be mass unemployment in the economy, as a result of which people would not be having adequate amount of money in their wallet to spend extravagantly, and as a result aggregate demand would reduce, which in turn would lead to a reduction in inflation. Now a very obvious question arises, why when the aggregate demand reduces, inflation would reduce? The very obvious answer is, it is bound to happen because the producers have already produced their goods and services which is lying in their inventory, and they would want to dispose of their existing stocks, which otherwise would increase their inventory cost. So they would like to reduce their profit margins and try to dispose of those products in the market as early as possible. Otherwise, over a period of time, those stocks could be converted to dead stocks for them and could result in heavy losses for them, right? Likewise, when taxes increase, people would have to end up shaving off a greater proportion of their income in terms of taxes, so they would be comparatively left with lesser quantities of their disposable money, and as a result they would naturally have a propensity to not spend them, rather instead to save them, and as a result aggregate demand would again reduce and the impact would be very similar. Producers in turn would be demotivated. They would first hand reduce the spending of their resources for manufacturing the goods and services, and at the same time their existing goods, whatever they have already produced, they would try to reduce their selling price and sell it off in the market so that they could at least get whatever they have invested in that particular business, and as a result inflation is bound to reduce. Now we would be looking at the monetary policy perspective. As I did tell you, fiscal policy is of course a method to either increase the aggregate demand or reduce the inflation, but monetary policy is very often implemented compared to fiscal policy because of how fast it is implementable and at the end of the day gives the results at a much shorter period of time compared to fiscal policy. So what are the two instruments of monetary policy? The two instruments of monetary policy are money supply and interest rates. So whenever expansionary monetary policy is implemented, we again see a similar effect. This is intended to increase the aggregate demand in the economy. So on one hand, the central bank might decide to increase the supply of money, or the other way to increase the aggregate demand would be to reduce the interest rates. Now, how does it work? Try to understand. When the supply of money increases, that means the central bank decides to print more amount of currency notes and circulate in the market. Obviously, there would be more number of people who would be having a greater amount of money in their wallet, and obviously they would have a natural propensity to spend in turn because now their wallet is full of money, correct? And that in turn would lead to an increase in aggregate demand. Whereas when the interest rates reduce, the very obvious consequence would be that more and more people would be interested to take loans, and likewise businesses would also be keenly interested to take loans and invest, and that in turn would lead to an increase in aggregate demand. Have you ever come across anybody who has taken loan from the bank and whatever money they have received, they have just locked it in their cupboard or in their locker or in their safe, and they have just been paying interest over a period of time without utilizing the money? You would never find that. The reason is very straightforward. They would be taking the loan only when they would have to purchase something or the other, which in turn would lead to an increase in the aggregate demand for goods and services and thereby prosper the economy, right? Likewise, what happens when contractionary monetary policy is implemented? When contractionary monetary policy is implemented, this in turn would lead to an opposite effect, wherein the two instruments would be used in the reversed manner, wherein the supply of money would be ideally reduced and the interest rates would be increased. So the consequence would be that in both the markets would not have adequate amount of money. In turn, people in the economy would be having a lack of money in their wallet, which in turn will demotivate them, and as a result they would not be looking forward to spending in order to buy goods and services. Likewise, when the interest rates increase, people would be dissuaded from taking loans from the bank, Likewise, businesses would also abstain from taking loans from the bank because it is going to be a costly affair for them. Borrowing would become costlier, and as a result, they would, in case of normal civilians, they would not be buying big ticket items like houses, cars, and so on and so forth. Likewise, businesses would not be setting up additional factories, which in turn could have led to an increase in aggregate demand. So in both these cases, it would lead to a reduction in aggregate demand in the economy over a period of time in the near future, which in turn will reduce the inflationary pressure in that particular economy. So with that, we complete the demand side policies. Please do let me know whether you were able to understand or not. Thank you. Have a great day.